Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Legal Pathways podcast. I'm your host, Charles Bowen, and I'm delighted in this episode to have with us Steven Wright, a technologist and longtime systems architect with AT&T. In his spare time, Steven is also a prolific writer, blogger, and inventor. He's a holder of more than 50 patents. Steve has an MBA from Arizona State University, his PhD in computer engineering from NC State, and a law degree from Georgia State University, where he's also served as an adjunct faculty member. Steve is the author of many academic papers and technical papers and more than 4 books, including the title we'll be discussing on tonight's episode, Blockchain, Smart Contracts, and the Law. Steve, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you here on the podcast.
Glad to be with you, Charles. Thanks for having me.
I was privileged to get an early review copy of your book, and I was fascinated by the breadth and reach of your thinking. But with 30 to 40 pages on monetary theory and going all the way down into the depths of Bitcoin mining, hash function, and other extremely technical operations. How were you able to combine that type of broad brush scope and reach with a level of detail like you were able to do?
The book started out as material for a class that I was teaching at Georgia State at the time. So that's part of the challenge, is when you've got a technology related topic and you're trying to explain it to a bunch of new lawyers. The technology background of most law students is relatively limited. I mean, there are a few that are deeply technical, but it's not the typical background. So I had to spend a fair amount of time trying to explain some of the technology background and why blockchains are unusual from that aspect. And then you get into the legal side of things, how people use them and what some of the potential legal consequences of the way they're using them could be. And that gets to be a fairly voluminous task to try and get your hands around. Lots of people focus in on the little niche that they're most interested in, things like Bitcoin, for example, or DeFi. But there is actually a broad range of ways to use blockchains. Some of them are much less controversial than others. So it's trying to explore that space.
Excellent. Well, I hope to continue that exploration in this episode. Steve, with AT&T and others, you've been at the forefront of corporate R&D, and I want to run a thought bubble by you. I follow a gentleman on LinkedIn, Jeffrey Funk, who's been a longtime professor at National University of Singapore, now a tech entrepreneur and investor. And his thesis is that the center of mass has shifted over the last 50 years in R&D from major corporation research laboratories like Bell Labs, AT&T, IBM, et cetera, into the research universities. And I wonder if you share that view or if you have a different perspective on where corporate R&D has gone versus academic R&D. And do you see that pendulum continuing to shift?
I think the pendulum has shifted, yes, to where there has been a lot more emphasis on primary research coming into universities, although that pendulum may be swimming a little back with budget restrictions and cutbacks in the universities these days. But I think there's a bunch of other trends that go on as well, depending on the technology you're talking about. So in the electronic software, high-tech type things, there's a sort of movement up the protocol stack. So whereas much earlier in my career, it was all about the electronics, how to get bits to go down a wire faster, how to use photons instead of bits on a wire, and now it's much more of a software and system problem. And so that shifts which types of companies do the research. So the telecom carriers were at the bleeding edge of technology in the early part of last century and had a significant industrial rollout through the 20th century, but that technology is fairly well understood, and I don't mean to belittle their efforts. That they have major rollouts still going on to deploy fiber to the next 20 million homes and to increase the speeds and feeds and services they provide. But much of the commercially interesting things are happening higher in the stack, in the application layer or in security services around things happening in software. So it's different companies. It's the Googles and device companies like Apple and so forth that are doing much more of the industrial R&D than companies like Bell Labs that might have been technology leaders many years ago.
There was an interesting piece in the Wall Street Journal a couple of weeks ago about a venture capital fund that's taking a PE type approach to investment in opportunities in blockchain companies. And they've raised $25 million to try to scale up innovation, invention in the blockchain space.
Yeah, I think there are several different companies doing things like that, both in the US and abroad. Each of the blockchains, and there are multiple different blockchains, right? Each of them has their own little ecosystem where they're trying to get more market traction, more adoption, and so forth. And that's been part of the challenge of a distributed, decentralized technology like blockchains. Is it's not having one company or one person using it is okay, it's a proof of concept, it's a demonstration, but really the value comes as it scales to more people, to more locations, and so forth.
I was hopeful in the global trade application that TradeLens, blockchain consortium between Maersk and IBM and a few other shippers, might kind of achieve that scale in that space. It didn't work for a number of reasons, and they shut their doors back in 2023. So I would love to see someone like a TradeLens consortium of people in one domain come together and do a similar thing.
Yeah, there's been a number of supply chain type efforts, both from companies like Walmart trying to push through their supply chain. I think one of the more promising aspects has been around using blockchains to trace the provenance of some particular goods, particularly in high value goods. And there was an example of pharmaceuticals where the technology seemed to hit at the same time as there was a regulatory push for enhanced traceability of the drug production pipeline. So trying to get that traceability to assure that somebody hasn't tampered with the ingredients upstream, as it were. And so there were various proposals for blockchains to be used for that purpose, and there were a number of trials and a legislative request for the Food and Drug Administration to set guidelines and standards in that area. And I haven't check to see where they've gotten with it lately, but that was looking quite promising a couple of years ago.
That sounds like the IBM Food Trust Network, where they are looking at provenience of crops and dairy products and things like that to have a trackability and promote food safety.
Yeah, I think there were some related efforts around trying to use blockchains for customs documentation as well. But again, this sort of, to get the adoption, it has to get adopted not just in industry, but also by the governments to take on that, accepting that form of documentation. So blockchain, at least under the previous administration, seemed to have more acceptance in the private sector than government. But the current administration seems to be more crypto friendly, so there may be more adoption in the government space coming.
So speaking of government attitude toward crypto, 2025 big news headlines for securities changes last year in treatment of Bitcoin and Ethereum as commodities rather than securities. So calling off the dogs, so to speak, of a lot of the Securities and Exchange Act investigations that were going on. Now actually positive movement with things like Project Crypto and the new stablecoin proposals under the Genius Act. What's your take on the current regulatory environment? Do you see these regulatory tailwinds continuing to move crypto and blockchain forward?
Yes, but I'm not as optimistic as some. I think there's a lot of hype in the blockchain space, particularly in the decentralized finance or DeFi space. And I think there were high expectations around the notion of a strategic Bitcoin reserve, which appears to be essentially consolidating all of the Bitcoin that the government holds into one repository. And then the the Genius Act, which basically defines stablecoins. I think that has opened the floodgates to a certain extent for both the existing financial industry, particularly the banks, and the folks in the DeFi space. It gives them a regulatory framework to proceed and move forward. And depending on who you talk to, stablecoins are the greatest thing since sliced bread, or it's a flash in the pan. And that's, I think, like a lot of new technologies, there's a lot of froth, and the eventual winners may not be the ones that get all the attention at the moment.
Yeah, I just saw something today on Bloomberg about Tether and the sort of the profitability bubble that they're in now that there's as you said, a regulatory framework for stable coins and the type of return they're getting on their investment to maintain the stable coins at par with the dollar. And it's pretty impressive. It's not something that may continue forever, but it looks like at least in the stable coin space, they've got quite a niche.
Yeah, stablecoin. Well, Tether is probably the biggest by market cap at the moment. There certainly are other alternatives out there. Circle is probably a good example in the DeFi space, and JP Morgan has their coin that I'm sure they'll be bringing forward at some stage. And then there are folks like XRP that have been beavering away at the use of their tokens to do settlement, which is essentially the main application here for these stablecoins. Because one of the Genius Act defines stablecoins the way it's defined it. The coin is essentially bound to some quantity of U.S. Treasury securities, but the coin's not allowed to issue interest, which is at first glance a little strange. What that means is if the bank, for example, is packaging up securities, treasury bills or something as collateral for their coin, they get to keep the interest, and the coin is just used for settlement. And settlement is a big application. You may not just holding a stable coin is not it's a method to liquidity. It's not a investment in the traditional sense.
Yeah.
So if you want to invest in crypto, you probably need to trade your dollars for stable coins and then trade the stable coins for Bitcoin or whatever other altcoin you want to invest in if you see crypto as an investment. So it does have some, it does make that crypto transactions using stablecoins, particularly internationally, it gives them a color of law, if you like, where they had been perhaps unfairly castigated as being primarily used for money laundering or something like that in the past. So this gives a veneer of legitimacy, at least for some of the transactions there.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what Bloomberg was talking about with Tether, that they are now have a stable framework to operate under and can use the coins as sort of a gateway to help people have an opportunity to buy crypto without the wild fluctuations.
Yeah, so that's the hope for the folks that are advocates of these stablecoins. I think the challenge, though, is whether they can maintain that stability. So probably the analogy is the money market accounts. So if you think of a money market account, they're similarly backed by treasuries, although they give you interest. But there have been times of financial market stress where they break the buck. The backing doesn't quite match what their nominal value is. And so that same kind of problem is a concern in the stablecoin space. And so I suspect there will be a flurry of regulations beyond the legislation around how you assure that the assets backing the stablecoin is in fact accessible and hasn't been over collateralized or something. So that's been an issue with Tether in the past, where their nominal value has dropped, and there's been concerns about how much assets they have backing their particular coins. I don't want to pick on Tether. I think the other ones are probably in the same boat as well.
Well, at least we've moved away from some of the algorithmic notional value behind some of the older stable coins.
Yeah. They're interesting experiments, and they certainly fit under the heading of creative finance. Although back at MBA school, I had an accounting professor who just told me that nobody really likes creative finance because it gets frequently spelt as fraud, right? That's kind of the part of the challenge here with this. There probably is some interesting innovations going on in there. It's just how do you sort out the interesting things, the real value add from the next pump and dump scheme.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to watch it evolve. Steve, what about the state of Wyoming? They just have launched, I believe, this first state stable coin, the Frontier coin, and I think that it has just dropped this month on the Hedera network. What are your thoughts about state or even federal government getting involved in this space?
That's another interesting twist on things, because there's a number of states that have baby steps in that direction. It's been pushing the envelope in a number of different ways. But there have been a number of states that have passed legislation, for example, that makes things like gold and silver legal tender in their states. So you can pay your taxes in the state in piles of metal coins. And so in that sense, it's not perhaps unreasonable for Wyoming to do something, although Wyoming has been trying to establish themselves as the leading state in the crypto space. Technically not, I think not the first. I think Vermont got out there with some legislation before them. Vermont had a what did they call it? A blockchain-based LLC, a VBLLC.
DAO LA.
So they started with that, and even Delaware tweaked their incorporation statutes to allow electronic records of the corporate records to be stored in electronic databases online, which enables DAOs and similar blockchains to be treated as entities as a Delaware LLC as well. But Wyoming was pushing out there with their DAO legislation as well a couple of years ago, and there is even Tennessee had a decentralized organization, I think about 2 years ago now. They passed that legislation, and I think Wyoming came out with another corporate form that they recognized, a DUNA, a decentralized unincorporated association. Basically a co-op is the notion that they're trying to provide. So that gets you an entity structure so you can get a tax ID, but it doesn't do any limited liability type effect. So it's kind of an odd corporate structure that's not, I think there's half a dozen, maybe 10 or 15 states that recognize UNAs as a corporate form. And I think there's some model legislation out there if you want to dig deeper for it. And that sort of evolved out of part of the social expectations around folks that are building these DAOs and other online open source software communities, where they were trying to create a different type of corporate entity or organization structure. Structure was supposed to be, but there's sort of one thread out there that folks see it as a more populist type of corporation. The problem with that is how do you keep everyone engaged and keep them voting in the DAO or whatever? Otherwise, it just sort of away, and you're left with somebody holding the bag or holding whatever assets are left in the DAO.
Yeah, and like you describe in your book, if there are creditor claims without an explicit recognition of the entity structure, the court may treat them as a general partnership, and the last person standing may be liable for all the debts of the enterprise.
Yeah. And in fact, it's I think even worse than that, because these are network structures. It's the blockchain exists online on the internet, and you can have nodes all over the country and in different countries. So if something bad were to happen and some of your nodes are in France, let's say, and some of your nodes are in the US, theoretically a French court could also assert jurisdiction on you, because even though you're in the US and never went to France, you were transacting on this blockchain and it impacted somebody in France. So it requires that collective action on the blockchain to finalize transactions. So legally speaking, where does that transaction happen? It's not happening just in one country, it's happening in multiple places. So you have this risk of liability arising in multiple jurisdictions, whether you're expecting it or not. And that's, I think, one of the arguments, at least for these legal structures like DAOs and LLCs or whatever. At least it gives you a structure and a situs where you can, that helps you fend the other ones off. You still need to deal with the laws of that jurisdiction, which may or may not be friendly depending on what you're trying to do.
Stephen, that extraterritoriality is a topic you describe in your book. And I actually had a thought a couple months ago when I was listening to a webinar from a very smart group of privacy lawyers, and they were talking about digital sovereignty and host nation guarding the personal information of its citizens, whether anonymized or de-identified or not. And it occurred to me that, if that data is maintained on a blockchain, it maybe an argument could be made that when it's shared among the blockchain network participants, that it's not actually going out of that jurisdiction, because the blockchain is owned and cited in every node in which a member operates, so that the information is not being passed outside of the jurisdiction. The privacy lawyers didn't know what to make of that question, but I wonder if you have a take on that. Does that extraterritoriality of blockchain maybe help in some respects in terms of sharing personal and privacy information?
There are ways to use blockchains to pass identity information or conversely use them for privacy. Generally, you would not want to store the private information on the blockchain, at least not on a public blockchain. So let me back up. I guess there's generally two types of blockchains. There's public blockchains and private blockchains. Private blockchains, think of something that's just running within one company. That's interesting, but you could probably do the same thing with an Oracle database or something else. So it doesn't bring the value that public blockchains do of operating in a somewhat trustless environment. And so the key thing with privacy and blockchains, particularly public blockchains, is you never put anything you want to keep private on the blockchain itself. You store it somewhere else, and you have a checksum that covers that data and just keep that checksum on the blockchain. So that way, if you think of something like GDPR, for example, that has constraints on the data of European citizens, and strongly encourages you to keep that data stored on servers in the EU somewhere and not outside of the EU. And so you'd want to have your blockchains maybe in multiple countries, but you'd be having to have data storage facilities somewhere in the EU that could manage those kinds of things.
Yeah, it's very transportable and easy to run afoul of jurisdictions where you don't even realize that you're operating.
Yeah. No, many jurisdictions have lots of other things on their mind, so this may not be the thing they're chasing at the moment, but sooner or later things may pop up, and particularly if they decide that this is a way to get some tax revenue, then it'll suddenly pop up on their radar.
Speaking of keeping data and databases on chain, lawyers love big data. It's a great thing to mine. It's a great thing to use for evidence, et cetera. And, part of our job as lawyers is to help our clients with record keeping and data governance. But traditionally, as heretofore, maintaining a true database on chain is very cumbersome, expensive, gas fees, et cetera. I know there are applications that are developing to maintain databases either on chain or on the next layer with peer-to-peer features, but also have robust databases. And the company I'm familiar with in that space is Ocean Protocol, who I know through my friends at SingularityNet. You have any thoughts about advancing databases where I can create research or keep data on chain or on a next app on the next layer?
So there's several, there was a flurry of research a few years ago around how to build a faster, better blockchain. And there's a number of those out there, all with their own claim to speed. And generally there's some technical trade-offs between how fast you want to go and the degree of security or consistency across all the transactions. So that's progressing. The real challenge with those is how do you get critical mass? How do you get adoption? And this is where I think the promise of the Genius Act is that there's now more of these legitimized stablecoins, so that will enable more transactions on these various networks. So there's that side of things. The notion of decentralization does play out in other ways as well. So two that I wanted to talk about. One is the notion of Web3, and the other is decentralized science. Web3 is kind of a marketing term of the next generation of the World Wide Web. The term used to mean the semantic web, where data was annotated in web pages, and then once blockchains came along, it tended to mean a decentralized storage in web pages. And so there are a number of decentralized online storage mechanisms that you can find if you search for Web3. You can think of it as a internet as a file system almost. So FileNet is one. That's there's another one called Swarm. There are several. They are typically baked into the web browser these days, so that you can upload and access them, kind of like you would a file through your web browser. But your file actually is stored in a decentralized fashion that's broken up into pieces and striped across multiple servers across the internet, essentially stored in a distributed hash table, which makes it very, very censorship resistant. terminology may seem a little unusual, but given all of the rising censorship in various countries these days, that's probably becoming very timely. There's always things that are unpopular to say or be seen saying in various countries at any given time. And so this is a way to both make something more difficult to take down, but also ensure that you get exactly the content you're asking for. Because instead of a file name, you're basically asking for or you're passing a crypto key to get the piece of content that you want. So it's from the technology side of the world, it would go by the name of content-based networking. You actually, instead of giving it a URL or an address, you're giving it the name of the content, which is the hash of the content, and the network finds out where it is and brings it back to you. So that's one side of things. So that's something interesting out there, and there are a number of projects trying to use that kind of infrastructure for the archival of big data sets, weather data, astronomical data, things that you really want to make sure that it still stays alive if some particular network or server or whatever gets taken down. That piece, the decentralized science, is not so much a technology, it's more of a movement to try to build on the open science and open data initiatives and open source notions to try to get general science projects structured in those kinds of open and censorship resistant databases. They become both publicly accessible and somewhat protected. If you Google decentralized science, you should find some references to work in that space.
This is fascinating, Stephen, and this idea that we can have decentralized databases that are resistant to censorship or massive failure of one regime. But at the same time, it almost strikes me as a bit of the Vili paradox, right? That in order to get to that level of adoption or scalability, we kind of diminish some of the advantages of a decentralized system by building up scale. Is that a legitimate thought, or are there reasons not to think about it that way?
Well, there's always a cost to infrastructure, and somebody's going to be paying that cost. So you may not see that when you're browsing the internet, but you're paying for it in the advertising you watch. So there is that sort of question around what's the business model driving this, and there are other legal issues as well. If somebody posts some offensive violation of copyright information on a website, right, then you can do a DMCA takedown notice to the hoster of that particular website. But how do you do that in Web3? You've got to actually go back to the person that promoted the content and put it out there in the first place, and they can be a lot harder to find. And so there is that sort of balance where it sounds all well and good to be promoting free speech and making it censorship resistant, but then on the other hand, there's occasions when you're infringing somebody else's rights and things need to be removed, or there's other penalties that apply, and how do you do that in that kind of environment? I think those things will eventually get worked out, but it's still a bit of the Wild West, and it still hasn't quite got the usability that everybody's used to with the web.
That's another thing that's been on my mind, is this kind of idea of blockchain as a service. I don't have my own wallet. I don't have a node. I'm just moderately technically competent. Most lawyers probably are in a similar boat as myself. And I wonder, does blockchain as a service become a model that makes it easier for people to approach these tools and applications?
It can. There are I think the big cloud providers, the Amazons and Googles of the world, offer blockchain as a service type service offerings. So that's primarily a value if you want to set up a new blockchain instance. That's not something majority of people just want to use their wallet to make a transaction with their blockchain, so they don't need that level of sophistication. If you want to run a blockchain mining node or something like that, or a blockchain validation node, depending on the blockchain you're on, then that might be interesting, but usually you'd want to do that on your own hardware rather than renting it from one of the big cloud providers. Because usually if you're doing mining at that scale, then the economics of the scale become important, and you want to optimize your hardware and so forth. Yeah, and that's another whole computer engineering exercise in terms of how to optimize your crypto mining rigs. And you can look on YouTube. There'll be lots of people telling you their greatest rig.
Yeah. See what's my exo hash rate? Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. You worry about the hash rate, and then there are other types of blockchains where the security is much less and the hashing function is much simpler. And this is typically seen for something like an IoT device where you're not worried about tampering so much as you just want some more resilience in the network if one or two nodes go down. So you get nodes talking to each other, and maybe two or three nodes need to process a transaction before you get it approved, as opposed to the whole network having to agree. So it's a much lower bar in terms of agreement. So that sort of IoT space and physical devices doing blockchain is one of the more interesting areas that I think people probably weren't initially thinking of, but there are a couple of interesting examples of that kind of thing out there. I'm not sure which chain specifically they're using in terms of protocols. But there's this whole category of decentralized physical infrastructure, DePIN or whatever they call it.
So are these like a network of decentralized washing machines that are sharing information?
Not so much washing machines. It's usually something where there is some value in sharing information. So there is probably the simplest example is the Helium network. So Helium will, or you can buy a little box that is a few $100s that is about the size of an internet router, and it will provide a public wireless service. It comes in a couple of different bands. They have one that provides basically 5G service. And it provides that over the wireless interface. It connects through your household internet over a VPN to the rest of their network, and you get some Helium tokens every time somebody makes a phone call using your piece of infrastructure. So you are the phone company for somebody else. And if you are in a high traffic location and you've got lots of people roaming in, that may be quite profitable. If you have the Helium node in the middle of the national park and there's no one around, it's not going to do you much good. It's that kind of thing where you get some network effects. There are others that collect weather data, so you can get a little weather station, put it on the roof of your house. You get your weather data, but you pool it with others, and when they sell their weather data set, you get some value to the tokens you get for weather data. And there is another one that does like these little cameras you put on your mirror when you're driving, like a traffic cam, and it just takes photographs of where you're driving randomly, or to you it appears random. They may care about where they take the photo. It's doing like the Google Maps cars when they drove around. It's doing
yeah,
a very
a
very smaller version of
Yeah.
that. So you get your tokens on that network if you get a photograph of something interesting that they're using. So there's those kinds of data sharing where you can build up to a bigger data set that has some commercial value to somebody.
Stephen, as usual, anytime we talk, I learn something new.
Well, glad to provide value.
Don't write off my washing machine idea, though, just yet. There may be some hidden value there too.
Well, they have plenty of microprocessors and controllers in those devices these days.
Stephen, thinking about practical implications of blockchain throughput, I've got to ask you about throughput. You know, the statistic I still quote is Bitcoin network is slow, 7 to 10 transactions per second, just a little faster than a good cashier at Walmart. You know, in the world of just-in-time e-commerce on demand, is blockchain able to keep up the pace to keep up with new applications? I've heard of things like sharding and other techniques to make it faster. What's the general state of play around throughput?
So it's getting faster. So you have blockchain, you have the blockchain Lightning Network as well, which is a faster implementation, and there are a lot of other networks that can provide much higher speeds than the original blockchain implementations. Generally speaking, the sort of benchmark these things get compared to is something like the credit card processing network. So the backbone transaction processing behind the Visa credit card or the MasterCard or something like this. And generally they're not quite in the same speed, but they are pretty close to that, is where some of the networks can get. But as I said, there is a trade-off there. So when you're doing a blockchain transaction, you're getting the transaction validated by the other nodes on the network, and that requires all of the other nodes to handle the transaction, and it takes time to send the transaction to all of those other nodes. And that's why the blockchains are slower than a more traditional client-server type transaction processing arrangement where you've just got one server node that has to process the transaction. The blockchains are getting faster, and there are 2 or 3 different ways in which they get faster. It depends on the specific blockchain you're looking at. Usually it's a slightly less secure blockchain that happens more quickly, and then the results from multiple transactions on that blockchain get rolled up to something that's slower and more secure. So if you think of it as stages of caching and archival, it takes, you can get a preliminary confirmation fairly quickly, but then to really get it propagated onto the blockchain, it takes a while longer.
That makes sense. Speeds and security and validation are not necessarily maybe competing priorities. Stephen, you and I talked a few years ago around the 2020 election about civic elections and governance, and at the time there were companies like Votes and others who were experimenting, at least on the state level, with using blockchain for civic elections. Have you seen any growth in this space? To me, it seems like it's got a lot of potential to help with both verifying the user with digital identity and also maintaining the security of the network with an immutable, permanent, unchangeable result. Any updates for me on the state of play in civic elections and blockchain?
It's been proposed multiple times. There's a bunch of different systems that have been developed. It hasn't been widely adopted as far as I'm aware. There's a few countries that have tried various proposals. Part of it is resistance on the part of institutions that run various elections. You have, anytime there's a partisan election structure, then there's going to be concerns about, well, whatever change, does it help me or does it help my opponent kind of thing? So there's those kind of concerns. But there's also just usability concerns. So when you talk about blockchain voting, you're talking about some sort of electronic system, and people aren't electronics, so they've got to go do something. Are they doing something on their mobile phone, or are they still going to a location and putting a punch card in a machine that then triggers to the blockchain or something? So how exactly the blockchain is being used, because there's a lot of procedures there around polling stations and things like that. So, and there's been a resistance, I think, in some cases to going to fully remote voting because of the authentication issues. How do you really know that the person voting is the person you think it is? A, and then B, how do you know that they're not under some sort of duress or undue influence situation? So normally you don't have firearms at a polling location. You don't have people with loud music and signs within 500 feet of the polling station and this kind of stuff. But if somebody's remote, how do you assure that that kind of thing hasn't tainted the vote in some way? I think the pandemic has made people a lot more willing to think of doing things remotely, but that doesn't automatically equate to just throw blockchain at it and that will solve all your problems. I think the other example I would throw in there is signatures, remote signatures. So that was the other thing that got pushed a lot through the pandemic. So there had been various pieces of legislation, and I go through some of that in the initial chapter in the book about different types of electronic signatures that were authorized over the years. But using electronic signatures for land transfers wasn't really a thing until the pandemic. And all of a sudden it became kind of important to be able to do these kinds of remote notarized signature events. There are the notion of electronic witnesses and electronic signatures on blockchains. And those things exist, but it's the way most electronic notaries for land transactions seem to have gone. You're having video recordings and people holding up their ID cards and all of these kinds of transactions that's giving you a human visible authentication, not just a cryptographic signatures. There may well be those things happening in the background. I think people still want to they want to hold a piece of paper with a blue ink signature and see a video recording of somebody that actually signed it, just to convince themselves that it's real, right? They just, if there's a lot of money on the line, then you do what you can to make sure that the transaction gets validated. I think a number of states have gone through with that sort of electronic notary things for land transactions these days, and so that's taken off. And the whole notion of tokenized real estate is another area that I used to have a lot of fun in the teaching the class with. This was somewhat a radical notion a few years ago, but you can now invest online in several tokenized real estate schemes these days that seem to be quite widely available and publicized. Things like Lofty and Mogul would be the two names I think of. I think there are a couple of others out there as well. So it lets you do fractional real estate investing. So essentially you're buying, for a small amount of money, shares in the LLC that owns some piece of rental real estate, and that has some management company that takes care of the day-to-day management. And as the shareholder in the LLC, you get to vote on whatever decisions need to be made, whether you sell the property, hire a new property manager, whatever. So that stuff seems to be becoming mainstream. Whereas if you search back in the newspaper archives 3 or 4 years ago, you'll see it made newspaper headlines when a house was sold on a blockchain. So it's this stuff is all becoming frighteningly real. So that may be good for you as an investor. It may open up lots of opportunities as a syndicator to do fractionalized real estate. But if you have to clear title through something like that, then it's just adds another layer of how do you unwind one of these things? Now you've got 500 people that own title to something that's gone into whatever.
You need that remote notary you were talking about.
It's these innovations create lots of opportunities, but you need to worry about how do you back out of them when you need to.
Yeah, it can get messy.
It can get messy.
So, Steven, as we're approaching our hour mark, we're talking about tokenized real estate. I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about our old friend NFTs, which you were kind enough to guide me on a project I worked on a couple years ago. Seems that their big moment has cooled off somewhat, but are you seeing any renewed interest or new applications for NFTs beyond the sort of tokenized original works of art or corporate cross promotions like the NBA shots, first takes, or Budweiser and some of those corporate promotions that were starting to get off the ground and kind of fizzled out?
Yeah, so NFTs as a technology thing they have lots of different applications beyond just the cartoon image of a bored ape or whatever, pudgy penguins, but there's a whole slew of different cartoon character type things. So I think there is a role for those things as not so much fine art, but as corporate promotional activities. So the sports team has their logo mascot in various poses on NFTs, and maybe they give those NFTs to fans at certain events or things like that. I think NFTs can also be used as an admission ticket, so it gets you access. It may have an image or not, or maybe it's just got a QR code on it or something. But having that token may give you admission to the event, admission to the club, admission to use a software tool. Even so, it could be a ticket in that sense, and I think that kind of use is more. I think that's people will find that more and more interesting because it's a way to manage those licenses a little bit easier. Because if you have a standard way to handle all of these licenses on your own wallet, it's a little bit easier than the nightmare of trying to manage all of your software licenses on your on your PC if you ever had to do that, because everybody's format was different, right? So if it's an NFT on a wallet, there's a way to make that a standard format. It becomes a little more portable, a little more easy to use.
Makes sense. It also aligns with sort of our generational shift from spending money on buying objects to buying experiences. So an NFT for a logoed event makes perfect sense.
Yeah, I think that is coming in some of the sporting events. I think the Australian Open tennis had a NFT at one stage. I don't know if they were I don't know if they have it for next year. I think they had it a couple of years ago. It just sort of depends on the crowd you're trying to attract. To people want to play with new things, some people don't. Again, it becomes how do you unroll these things if you ever have to? There was one of the earlier examples was a band, the Wu-Tang Clan, who had a album that they never released. They locked it up under an NFT, and it's been auctioned and gone through bankruptcy court in a couple of other places. It's just
Oh no.
tracking around until somebody actually manages to take it and do something with it. Yeah. So I think NFTs as collectible characters, I think that they were the Beanie Babies of their day, if you like.
Drat. I'll save them for my grandchildren.
You have to explain to them what they are.
Make sure I have your phone number so I can explain them in 25 years. Well, Steven, any final thoughts for our listeners as we think about directional or use cases for blockchain in the next 3 to 5 years that we should be thinking about?
So I think there are lots of different ways blockchains can be used, but the majority of ways that were proposed have not been very useful, or at least have not come into wide adoption so far. There is a lot of enthusiasm and froth around decentralized finance, and with the Genius Act, that I think will continue. My crypto tends to go in waves of excitement and then dies back as a market crash in terms of valuations if you value it that way. And it's been riding a little high because of the regulatory pressure that used to be there under the last administration has come off, and so things have increased in valuation. There's been more optimism. I suspect there will be another crypto winter, probably sooner than anybody wants. And I suspect there will be another number of frauds associated with stablecoins and the Genius Act implementations. Hopefully they will get discovered sooner rather than later, but that's unfortunately, I think, the way of the world. But my caveat on that is it gets a bad rap for being associated with financial crimes. But I think there's an old quote from, I think it was Willie Horton, why did you rob banks? Well, that was where the money is. I think there's actually more crime in the real financial system because there's more money there. So there's a scale proportion. There may well be large-scale bad things happening, but that's not the only place where bad things happen. So if you're investing, beware.
Yeah, good words of advice. My hope is as broad as more broader acceptance of crypto and blockchain, that regulatory, understandable, reasonable regulations will follow a pace, and maybe just like the Wild West was settled, maybe the crypto space will get settled too.
I think it will. And I think a lot of it comes down to good cybersecurity hygiene, whether you're in TradFi or DeFi. Don't send your social security number to the next email from a Nigerian prince or whatever.
Yes.
People need to develop those kind of habits, and that's kind of the bigger challenge. There's always going to be scammers out there, and you need to find ways to defend yourself.
Steven, great advice, great insights. Great to have you with us. Thank you as always for taking the time to talk with us, and it's been a real pleasure.
Thanks for talking to me. Great to be with you.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us. If you like what you heard, please make sure to follow us on your favorite podcast channel. And until next time, I'm Charles Bowen for the Legal Pathways Podcast.